Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a decade that looked at the entire history of human clothing, shrugged, and said, what if we just didn't? We're talking about the 1960s, a 10-year period during which the human race collectively lost its mind in the most spectacular, sequined, and geometrically offensive way possible. A time when perfectly reasonable adults looked in the mirror wearing a silver paper dress, knee-high vinyl boots, and a hat shaped like a flying saucer, and thought, yes, this is it. This is the look. So before you pull your very normal blanket over your very normal body, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and I want you to know that your idea made this possible. Every suggestion shapes this channel, and I don't take that lightly. If you want to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is, please do. It's always midnight somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Also, if you prefer to listen while you drift off, we are now on Spotify. The link is in the description. Go check it out. Now, dim those lights, turn on your fan, get horizontal, pull something soft over yourself, something made of fabric that does not crinkle, doesn't reflect light, and was not manufactured from recycled aluminum foil. Because tonight we are going somewhere that cannot guarantee any of those things. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live inside the fashion of the 1960s? Did people genuinely feel stylish? Or did they just assume everyone else was equally confused? What did it feel like to go to work in a miniskirt so short it was essentially a wide belt? Did women actually sleep in their beehive hairdos? And if so, how? Was there a single human being on the planet who looked at a pair of go-go boots and thought, these seem practical for my lifestyle? Did men wake up every morning, pull on a psychedelic paisley shirt with a collar the size of a small aircraft, and feel genuinely powerful? Who decided that the colour combination of orange, avocado green, and hot pink was not a warning, but a fashion statement? And did anyone at any point ask whether a plastic see-through raincoat was a good idea before it was already on every runway in Paris? Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1962. Your hair is enormous. Your skirt is approximately 11 inches long. Your co-worker is wearing a shirt that appears to be on fire aesthetically. You have a closet full of things that should not exist, and today, for some reason, you're going to wear all of them. Good luck. For nearly a decade before the 1960s arrived, women's fashion had been worshipping at the altar of the cinched waist. The 1950s demanded curves, structured boning, padded hips, waists, pulled so tight that breathing was considered optional. Then the 60s showed up, looked at all of that engineering and decided the human torso should simply be a rectangle. The shift dress, boxy, loose, falling straight from shoulder to thigh, became the defining silhouette of the early decade, and its arrival was less a fashion choice and more an ideological declaration. The waist was not just unfashionable, it was practically suspicious. To understand what a dramatic departure this was, you have to appreciate just how much the 1950s had invested in the hourglass. Christian Dior's new look, introduced in 1947, had rebuilt post-war fashion around the waist as its central axis. Everything nipped in, everything flaring out. The body treated as a kind of architectural drawing that needed a clearly defined midpoint. Women wore long-line bras, padded girdles, and foundation garments with the structural complexity of a small suspension bridge, all in service of maintaining that curve. It was by any reasonable modern standard an extraordinary amount of infrastructure to put on before breakfast. And then the shift arrived. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the thing you spent 15 minutes every day squeezing yourself into was no longer required, that your body, in its natural uncinched state, was now not just acceptable, but actively fashionable. For some women this was liberation finally, a silhouette that did not require engineering. For others, it was alarming, because they had spent considerable time and money building a wardrobe around an entirely different geometry, and that wardrobe was now, overnight, wrong. The shift dress was deceptively simple. A straight seam from shoulder to hem, no waist definition, often sleeveless, often in a bold solid colour or a graphic print. It looked easy to wear, and it was, assuming your body happened to fall in a straight line from collarbone to thigh, which is to say, it looked easy to wear if you were shaped roughly like the models who wore it, and considerably more complicated if you were shaped like a person. The irony was not lost on many women at the time, who pointed out that replacing one impossible ideal with a different impossible ideal was not quite the liberation it had been sold as. What the shift dress did brilliantly, however, was clear the runway, figuratively, for everything that followed. By removing the waist as fashion's organising principle, it opened up the entire silhouette to experimentation. If the body was no longer a curve to be emphasised, it could be a canvas. It could be covered in geometric prints. It could be cut at unexpected angles. It could stop at whatever height the designer decided was appropriate that season, which in the mid-60s turned out to be an increasingly ambitious one. The shape also made clothes faster and cheaper to produce, which meant it moved quickly from the runways of Paris into every high street in Britain and America. Young women who could never have afforded couture could afford a shift dress. Suddenly, the silhouette of fashion was no longer the exclusive property of women with tailoring budgets. It belonged to everyone, even if everyone was standing in front of the mirror wondering where exactly their waist had gone and whether it was coming back. It was not coming back. Not for a while, anyway. There is a moment in fashion history so seismic that it deserves its own paragraph of warning, and that moment is the arrival of the miniskirt in 1965. British designer Mary Quant is often credited with its invention, though the French designer André Courreges was making similarly hemline challenging pieces around the same time, and both camps argued about this with the kind of passion usually reserved for matters of national security. What everyone agrees on is the effect. The miniskirt did not simply shorten a hem, it detonated the entire concept of what women were allowed to show, do and be, and it did so while looking, depending on the decade you were born in, either wildly liberating or deeply, deeply breezy. Let's establish some context. Before the miniskirt, hemlines had been moving upward gradually throughout the early 60s. The knee had already been revealed, which was itself considered fairly bold. But the mini took that trend and accelerated it to a conclusion that nobody in 1958 would have predicted or, in many cases, been ready for. A miniskirt sat several inches above the knee. In its more committed forms, it sat considerably further above the knee than that. It was, in the simplest possible terms, a very short skirt, and the world responded to it as though it were a philosophical argument that required an immediate and loudly expressed position. Newspapers ran editorials, church leaders offered opinions, politicians, who one might have thought had other things to attend to, commented on hemlines with a frequency that suggested they found this a more manageable problem than the ones actually on their desks. Women who wore miniskirts were variously described as brave, immoral, modern, threatening, fashionable and irresponsible, sometimes in the same article. The level of cultural noise generated by a garment that was, at its core, simply a skirt that was short, remains one of the more remarkable overreactions in the history of textile criticism. What the miniskirt required, practically speaking, was a complete renegotiation of how a woman moved through the world. Sitting down required thought. Getting out of a car required strategy. Bending over required a level of planning that turned simple tasks into minor logistical operations. Women adapted because women always adapt, but the adaptation was real and it was ongoing, and it involved a level of daily spatial awareness that the men writing editorials about the miniskirt's moral implications were not themselves required to exercise. Mary Quant, for her part, was cheerfully unapologetic. She named the miniskirt after her favourite car, the Mini Cooper, and described it as a garment that allowed women to run for a bus. This was practical, joyful reasoning. It was also, in its quiet way, a rebuke to every fashion system that had previously prioritised how women looked while standing completely still over whether they could actually move. The miniskirt spread with a speed that suggested it had been wanted for some time. By 1966 it was everywhere, on Carnaby Street, on Fifth Avenue, in every department store that could produce one fast enough to meet demand. It was worn by secretaries and students and actresses, and eventually by women who had initially thought it was not for them and then tried one on and reconsidered. It was short, it was impractical, it changed everything. If the 60s had an unofficial mascot, it was not a flower child with paint-streaked cheeks or a mod girl in white, vinyl. It was the beehive, a hairdo so structurally ambitious that it bordered on civil engineering. The beehive, which reached its peak popularity in the early part of the decade, involved ratting, teasing, pinning, and spraying the hair upward into a rounded dome that sat atop the head like a very committed hat that refused to leave. The hair was not styled so much as constructed. Women reportedly slept with their beehives wrapped in toilet paper to preserve the shape overnight, which means that for several years, a significant portion of the female population was going to bed looking like a fragile monument. The construction process alone deserves a moment of respectful attention. To build a proper beehive, you began by backcombing, taking sections of hair and combing them backward toward the roots, creating a matted, dense internal structure that provided the volume necessary for the dome. This was not gentle work. It was aggressive and it was thorough, and it left the hair in a state that hair was not naturally designed to inhabit. On top of this backcombed foundation, you smoothed the outer layer of hair upward and over, pinning it into place with enough hairpins to make airport security nervous, and then, crucially, you lacquered the entire structure with hairspray. Not a light mist. A committed, sustained, room-filling cloud of aerosol that sealed the beehive into something approaching permanence. The result was a hairdo that could withstand a reasonable wind. It could not, however, withstand sleeping on it without assistance, which is where the toilet paper came in. Women wrapped their beehives before bed to protect the shape, then unwrapped them in the morning and touched up whatever had shifted in the night. It was, by any reasonable definition, a relationship, one that required daily maintenance, periodic reconstruction, and an ongoing willingness to treat your own head as a project. The beehive also created a very specific set of practical complications that are not often discussed in the fashion histories. It added considerable height, which was fine until you needed to sit in a car, a cinema seat, or anywhere with a low ceiling. It was not compatible with hats, which created problems at formal occasions where hats had previously been mandatory. It was, in the warmest months, an additional layer of insulation on the part of your body least in need of it. And because the interior of the beehive was essentially a compressed mat of back-combed hair that had been sprayed into position, washing it was not a casual undertaking. It required dismantling the entire structure and starting again, which many women did only as often as was strictly necessary. Urban legends accrued around the beehive with remarkable speed. Stories circulated and were reported as fact in several newspapers of women who had not washed their hair in weeks, discovering, upon finally dismantling the beehive, that something had been living inside it. Insects. Occasionally, allegedly, spiders. The stories were almost certainly exaggerated, but they persisted because they contained a kernel of structural truth. A beehive that had been sealed with hairspray and left undisturbed for an extended period was, in principle, exactly the kind of dark, warm, sheltered space that something small might find appealing. The beehive eventually gave way to other styles, the geometric bob, the long and straight styles of the later 60s, but while it lasted, it was one of the most committed aesthetic statements the decade produced. It said, "I have decided what my hair is doing today, and my hair has agreed, and we are both going to hold this position." Somewhere around 1964, fashion designers collectively looked at the space race and concluded that the correct response was to dress everyone as though they were about to be launched into low Earth orbit. The space-age aesthetic, pioneered by designers like Courreges, Pierre Cardin, and Paco Rabanne, produced some of the most aggressively futuristic clothing ever seen on a human body. We are talking white vinyl coats, chrome accessories, helmet-shaped hats, dresses made from interlocking metal discs, and boots so white they appeared to generate their own light. The idea was that fashion should look forward, toward the moon, toward technology, toward a gleaming tomorrow. The result was that millions of people spent the mid-60s looking like they were extras in a science fiction film that was not entirely sure what the future smelled like. The context matters here. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. In 1962, John Glenn did the same for the American side. The space race was not an abstract concept. It was front-page news, dinner-table conversation, and the dominant narrative of technological optimism in a decade that had an almost desperate need for optimistic narratives. The idea that human beings were going to leave the planet was not science fiction anymore. It was happening. And fashion, which has always had an acute sensitivity to the cultural moment, looked at this and decided that the appropriate response was to dress for the destination. The practical consequences of this decision were, to put it gently, mixed. Courreges produced white vinyl coats with cut-out panels that were beautiful in a photograph, and, in the actual world, waterproof in the same way that a white vinyl coat is waterproof, which is to say, entirely on the outside and not at all on the inside, where condensation made them an experience best described as wearing a small greenhouse. Pierre Cardin's geometric shapes looked extraordinary on a runway, and slightly confrontational in a restaurant. Paco Rabanne's metal disc dresses, which we will return to in their own dedicated segment, because they deserve it, were genuinely not compatible with sitting down quickly. The helmet hat deserves special attention. Produced by several designers as an accessory to their space-age collections, the helmet hat was a rigid domed covering for the head that sat low over the forehead, leaving the face framed in a perfect oval. It was meant to suggest an astronaut's visor. It did suggest an astronaut's visor. It also suggested someone who'd been caught in moderate rain and responded by putting a salad bowl on their head, but in a chic way. Women who wore them reported that peripheral vision became something of a luxury. The space-age look required a specific kind of commitment from the wearer. It did not allow for ambiguity. You could not put on a chrome accessory and a flowing floral dress and have either of them work. The aesthetic demanded internal consistency. You were either of the future or you were not, and the future, according to the designers of 1964 to 1967, was white, geometric, and absolutely certain of itself. Whether any of it was comfortable is a question the fashion histories tend to gloss over. The answer, in most cases, was, not especially. But comfort, the 60s kept insisting, was beside the point. The point was the future. And the future apparently had a dress code. By the time the mid to late 60s arrived, subtlety had been fully retired. The counterculture movement brought with it an explosion of colour, pattern and visual noise so intense that looking at a photograph of a 1967 crowd feels like staring directly into a kaleidoscope, one that is spinning, on fire, and has somehow also eaten a bag of crayons. Psychedelic prints, swirling paisleys, op-art spirals, neon florals, geometric hallucinations covered everything. Shirts, dresses, trousers, scarves, curtains, upholstery, and in some documented cases the people wearing all of those things simultaneously. The patterns were not designed to complement the wearer so much as to consume them entirely. To understand the psychedelic print, you have to understand what it was reacting against. The early 60s mod aesthetic had been graphic, yes, but also controlled. Black and white, clean geometry, deliberate minimalism. Psychedelic fashion was its opposite in every possible dimension. Where mod was precise, psychedelic was sprawling. Where mod was cool and detached, psychedelic was warm, overwhelming and deeply committed to making an impression from across the street. The shift happened quickly, roughly between 1966 and 1967, and it was connected directly to the counterculture's expanding interest in altered states of consciousness, Eastern philosophy, and the work of certain musicians who were themselves exploring similar territory. The colours were the first thing. Neon pink alongside neon orange alongside electric blue, combinations that, in any other context, might have served as a warning system. Lime green next to purple next to hot pink, arranged in swirling patterns that had no clear starting point and no discernible ending point, just an ongoing, enthusiastic conversation of colour that showed no signs of wrapping up. Wearing a psychedelic print in a moderate-sized room meant that the room, to some extent, also became the print. Then there was the paisley. The paisley pattern, a teardrop shape with a curved point, derived from Persian and Indian textile traditions and adopted with enormous enthusiasm by the Western counterculture, appeared on everything in the late 60s. Silk shirts, cotton blouses, ties so aggressively patterned that they seemed to vibrate slightly when observed directly. The paisley itself was not new. It had been in use for centuries before the 60s discovered it, but the scale at which the 60s deployed it and the colours in which it was reproduced were entirely unprecedented. What is striking, looking back, is how total the conversion was. This was not a niche trend confined to certain subcultures. By 1968, psychedelic prints were available in mass-market department stores, worn by people who had no particular connection to the counterculture, reproduced on children's clothing, and printed on home furnishings. The whole thing moved from underground to mainstream in roughly 18 months, which is either a testament to the power of the aesthetic or a sign that a very large number of people were simply ready to stop wearing beige. The eye, given no quiet place to rest in a room full of psychedelic print, responds by trying to process everything simultaneously and achieving a state that is less relaxation and more low-grade visual fatigue. This was not considered a design flaw in 1967. It was considered the point. In 1965, an exhibition called The Responsive Eye opened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it changed fashion in a way that nobody anticipated and several ophthalmologists later regretted. Op art, optical art, used geometric shapes, black and white contrasts, and precise patterns to create the illusion of movement, vibration, and depth on a flat surface. When fashion designers got their hands on this concept, they did what fashion designers always do. They put it on a dress and sent it down a runway. The result was clothing that appeared to move even when the person wearing it was standing completely still. Entire outfits consisted of concentric circles, zigzag stripes, and checkerboard panels arranged with such precision that simply looking at a woman crossing the street could give you a mild headache. The artists most associated with op art, Bridget Riley, Victor Vasarely, Richard Anuskevich, had developed their work within the context of fine art, exploring how the eye processes visual information and where it can be productively deceived. Riley, in particular, was horrified when her work was immediately translated into fashion. She had created paintings that made the eye vibrate with the sensation of movement. She had not, as she later made clear with considerable feeling, intended for those paintings to be reproduced on a mini dress and sold in a boutique on Fifth Avenue. The fashion industry, which has always had a complicated relationship with the concept of intellectual property when a good idea is available, proceeded regardless. The op art garment worked by placing high contrast patterns, typically black and white, though colour versions appeared as the trend developed, in configurations that the eye could not quite resolve into a stable image. A dress covered in concentric circles seemed to spiral. A top made of alternating black and white zigzags appeared to ripple. Worn by a person in motion, these garments created effects that were either mesmerising or nauseating, depending on how close you were standing and whether you had eaten recently. The practical experience of wearing an op art garment was, by several accounts, stranger than it sounds. Because the pattern was designed to create the illusion of movement, the wearer often had the unsettling sensation that the clothing itself was doing something, shifting, pulsing, doing something visually active in the wearer's peripheral vision. Several women who wore op art dresses in the mid-60s reported that looking down at themselves in a brightly lit room was an experience they undertook cautiously. For observers, the effect varied. From a distance, an op art outfit read as bold and striking, exactly the statement it was designed to make. Up close, particularly in motion, it created a visual field that the brain processed as movement, even while knowing intellectually that a dress was not, in fact, moving. This gap between what the eye reported and what reason knew to be true is precisely what op art was designed to exploit. The 60s wore it and called it fashion. The ophthalmologists called it Tuesdays. What the op art trend demonstrated, perhaps more than any other fashion movement of the decade, was the 60s fascination with the visual as a site of experience, something to be activated and challenged rather than simply looked at. Clothing was not decoration. Clothing was an event. Whether the person looking at it was ready for the event was not, in 1965, considered the wearer's concern. The go-go boot is one of those fashion items that, when you encounter it in a museum or a vintage photograph, prompts you to ask a series of increasingly reasonable questions that the 60s simply refused to answer. Questions such as, why does this boot end precisely at the knee and not an inch higher or lower? Why is it white? Why is it always white? Why is the toe so round, so perfectly, deliberately round, as though the designer was asked to create a boot and had never seen a human foot? The go-go boot arrived in the early 60s and became the defining footwear of the mod movement, paired with miniskirts and shift dresses in a combination that said, simultaneously, I am very fashionable and I have just arrived from a planet with slightly different gravitational laws. The name itself requires a brief detour. Go-go derived from the French phrase à gogo, meaning in abundance or galore, and it became associated with go-go dancing, a style of energetic, high-kicking dance performed by dancers at clubs and on television programs throughout the 60s. Go-go dancers wore the boots. The boots, by association, became go-go boots. The naming logic is impeccable, and also somehow tells you everything you need to know about the decade, which named things after the energy they represented rather than the function they performed. The boots were almost always white, at least in their most iconic form, and this created maintenance challenges that the fashion industry did not adequately prepare consumers for. White vinyl or white leather knee-high boots, worn regularly, are not white for long. They scuff. They mark. They require cleaning with a frequency and dedication that the average person, already managing a beehive and a paper dress, may not have had available. The alternative, accepting that your go-go boots were going to become off-white go-go boots, then cream go-go boots, then a colour best described as optimistic, was an aesthetic compromise that sat uneasily with the pristine space-age look they were meant to complete. The heel was another distinctive feature. Not a stiletto. Stilettos were from a different era, a different emotional register entirely. The go-go boot had a small stacked heel, solid and purposeful, that communicated practicality alongside the fashion statement. You could, theoretically, walk briskly in a go-go boot. You could dance in it. It was, in this sense, more wearable than many of the garments it was designed to accompany, which is perhaps why it outlasted several of them in the cultural memory. What the go-go boot did, aesthetically, was extend the line of the leg upward in a way that the flat shoe or the court shoe could not. Paired with a miniskirt, the boot and the bare leg between them created a graphic, high-contrast image that read powerfully from a distance. It was fashion as geometry, the boot a solid white column below, the leg a line above, the miniskirt a horizontal at the top. Simple, bold, immediately readable. The 60s, which understood visual impact in a way that few decades have before or since, knew exactly what it was doing. The questions the go-go boot raises about colour, about shape, about the relationship between footwear and the rest of the outfit are, in the end, answered by simply looking at how it worked in practice. Photographed in black and white, in its natural habitat of a Carnaby Street boutique or a televised dance programme, the go-go boot looks completely right. It is only when you look at it outside of that context, alone, in a museum display case, under contemporary lighting, that the round toe and the determined whiteness start to seem like choices that require a conversation. In 1966, the Scott Paper Company did something that no paper company had any business doing. It released a dress. Not as a joke, not as a publicity stunt, though it was certainly that too. It released an actual dress, made from a non-woven cellulose fibre, that people were expected to wear in public, potentially to dinner, and then, and this is the part that the modern sustainable fashion movement would like to have several words about, throw away. The disposable paper dress became a genuine trend. Designers produced paper garments printed with pop art graphics, op art patterns, and Andy Warhol imagery. Women wore them, sometimes more than once, which was technically against the spirit of the thing. The dresses rustled when you walked, could not be rained upon, and had the structural integrity of a very confident napkin. The Scott Paper Company's original paper dress was offered as a promotional item. Send in $1 and a proof of purchase from a Scott. Paper product, and you would receive a dress in the mail in one of two patterns, either a black and white op art design or a red and yellow bandana print. The company expected to sell 5,000 of them. It sold over 500,000. The fashion industry, which recognized a trend when it arrived in an envelope, immediately began producing its own versions, and for approximately 18 months, disposable clothing was presented as a serious and exciting development in the history of fashion. The reasoning from a 1966 perspective had a certain internal logic. This was a decade deeply in love with technology, newness, and the idea that the solutions of the future would be entirely different from the solutions of the past. Washing clothes was time-consuming. Storing a wardrobe was expensive. What if, instead of those problems, you simply wore something once and discarded it? What if fashion was as convenient as a paper towel? The idea was very much of its moment, a moment that had not yet fully reckoned with the environmental consequences of treating clothing as a consumable. Wearing a paper dress was, by accounts from women who did it, an experience unlike any other. The material rustled. Every time you moved, sat, stood, turned, or breathed too enthusiastically, the dress announced the fact. Sitting in a paper dress meant that the dress began, slowly and irreversibly, to conform to the shape of the chair in a way that fabric does not. Humidity affected it. A spilled drink could end the evening. Dancing in one required the kind of careful, measured movements that are not, generally speaking, the goal of dancing. Despite all of this, women wore them, and some wore them with genuine enthusiasm, because the prints were genuinely exciting, and the price was genuinely low, and the novelty was, at least for the duration of one evening, genuinely fun. The paper dress was fashion as performance art, a garment that drew attention, prompted conversation, and made a very clear statement about its own disposability. Whether that statement was meant as a celebration or a provocation depended on who was wearing it and who was watching. By 1968, the trend had largely passed, undone by a combination of practical inconvenience and the realization that wearing paper to dinner was, on reflection, perhaps not the future anyone actually wanted. The paper dress did not change fashion permanently, but it is one of the more honest documents the decade left behind, a garment that made the 60s belief in novelty for its own sake completely, breathtakingly legible. For most of recorded human history, menswear had operated on a fairly conservative set of principles: dark colours, minimal pattern, nothing that moved on its own. The 1960s dismantled all of this with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered they were not, in fact, bound by any of those rules. Suddenly, men were wearing Nehru jackets with no lapels, wide-collared shirts in shades of mustard and magenta, double-breasted suits in window-pane check, so large it could be seen from moderate distances, and trousers with flares that started at mid-thigh and cascaded to the floor like a very committed textile waterfall. The Beatles were partly responsible, Pierre Cardin was very responsible, and every man who looked in the mirror nodded thoughtfully and walked out of the house wearing a ruffled tuxedo shirt to the supermarket was entirely responsible. The transformation of menswear in the 60s happened in two distinct waves. The early part of the decade brought the mod look, sharp, slim, Italian-influenced tailoring in bold but still relatively controlled colours. The mod suit had a short jacket, narrow lapels, slim-cut trousers, and was worn with a thin tie in a way that communicated youth and intention. This was not your father's suit. This was a suit that made a point. The point was mostly, I am young, and I am aware of that, and I would like you to also be aware of that. The second wave, arriving with the counterculture in the mid to late 60s, was considerably less restrained. Shirts developed collars that spread across the chest like a topographical feature. Patterns that had previously been confined to curtains and upholstery appeared on men's outerwear. Velvet was worn in the evening, then in the afternoon, then by certain committed individuals in the morning. Colours that had not previously been associated with men's clothing, not just bold colours, but deeply, specifically unusual colours, colours that seemed to have been named by someone with an adventurous relationship to the colour wheel, arrived on shirts, trousers, scarves, and occasionally on all four at once. The Carnaby Street boutiques drove much of this. Male customers who walked into boutiques like John Stevens, his clothes in the early part of the decade discovered that clothing for men did not have to be a uniform. It could be, in the words of the era, a statement. The fact that the statement was sometimes difficult to read did not diminish the enthusiasm with which it was made. Men who had worn navy blue suits every working day of their adult lives found themselves holding a purple paisley shirt and thinking, perhaps. What is notable in retrospect is how permanent some of these changes were and how quickly others vanished. The slim-cut suit remained. The wide collar became a reliable indicator of the decade in period photographs. The ruffled tuxedo shirt enjoyed a brief, magnificent reign, and then retreated into the specific category of things that seemed like a good idea in 1968. The flared trouser returned, periodically, in each subsequent decade, as though checking to see whether conditions had finally become favourable again. They had not, generally speaking. But the 60s wore them anyway, and wore them with a confidence that the rest of the wardrobe absolutely demanded. In 1966, a 17-year-old girl from London named Leslie Hornby was photographed by Barry Latigan. The image was published in a newspaper, and overnight the fashion world decided it had found its new icon. Twiggy, as she was immediately nicknamed, owing to her extraordinarily slender frame, became not just a model but a template. Her enormous eyes, her short pixie hair, her long-limbed, almost boyish silhouette became the aesthetic ideal that fashion chased for the rest of the decade and, honestly, well into the next several ones. The implications were significant. Where previous decades had celebrated curves, the 60s pivoted toward a figure so slight it required models to be fed specific quantities of nothing and shot under strategic lighting. Twiggy's appeal, to be fair, was not simply about her size. She had an extraordinary face, large, expressive eyes that she enhanced with elaborate painted lashes beneath the lower lid, giving her a look that was simultaneously childlike and otherworldly. She had an ease in front of the camera that translated immediately into printed images. She was, by all accounts, genuinely funny and warm in person, qualities that rarely appear in the official historical record, because the official historical record was mostly interested in her measurements. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed approximately 91 pounds at the height of her career, figures that were reported with the same uncritical admiration as her Vogue covers. The look she embodied was inseparable from the clothes she was photographed wearing. The shift dress, the miniskirt, the graphic mod prints, all of these garments functioned most cleanly on a frame without curves to interrupt the lines. Fashion was, in a very direct sense, designing for one specific body type, and then presenting that body type as the universal one. This was not new, fashion has always done this, but the 60s version was particularly stark, and the contrast with the previous decade's celebration of the hourglass was particularly visible. What Twiggy represented culturally was something more complicated than a body type. She was young, conspicuously, deliberately young, at a time when youth was the decade's central preoccupation. She came from a working-class background, which broke with the tradition of fashion's aristocratic models. She was English, and specifically London English, at the moment when London was the most culturally significant city in the world. She was, in the language of the time, of the moment, and being of the moment in 1966 meant being Twiggy. The influence on real women's relationship with their bodies was, as subsequent decades would make clearer, not uncomplicated. The shift dress that sat beautifully on Twiggy's frame looked very different on a woman built differently, and yet the fashion system offered no alternative, no other version of the garment, no acknowledgement that bodies came in other configurations, no suggestion that a dress might be designed for more than one kind of person. This was not unique to the 60s, but the 60s did it with an unusual degree of specificity. Here is the body, and here is the one girl who has it, and here is the name of the girl, and here is her photograph on the cover of every magazine. This is what you are meant to look like. Good morning. Twiggy herself went on to have a long and varied career, in film, in theatre, in television, in music, and has spoken thoughtfully in later years about the strange experience of becoming, at 17, a standard against which other people measured themselves. She did not invent the pressure. She simply, briefly, and brilliantly embodied it. In 1968, the Nehru jacket arrived in Western fashion with the kind of confidence that suggested it had been expected for some time. Named after Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, who wore a similar style of collarless, close-fitting jacket as part of his signature look, the Western version was adopted wholesale by designers and celebrities who found in its clean, upright silhouette something futuristic and vaguely spiritual. The Beatles wore them, Sammy Davis Jr. wore them. Pierre Cardin, who at this point had decided that every fashion choice should look as though it belonged in a film set 200 years from now, made many of them. The jacket had no lapels, which sounds like a small thing until you understand that the lapel had been the organising principle of the Western suit jacket for over a century. To remove the lapel was, in the context of 1968 men's fashion, an act of genuine boldness. The lapel was where your pocket square went. It was the surface against which a boutonniere was pinned. It framed the shirt and tie, gave the jacket its structure, communicated formality or informality through its width and shape. Men had been navigating the language of lapels for generations. The Nehru jacket arrived and said, none of that. No lapels, no tie. A simple stand collar at the throat. The jacket closing cleanly from chin to hip with a row of small buttons. The whole thing suggesting a kind of serene self-containment that the traditional suit, with all its flaps and openings, could not achieve. The spiritual dimension was not incidental. The late 1960s were a period of intense Western interest in Eastern philosophy, religion, and aesthetics, an interest that expressed itself in everything from the Beatles' visit to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in India, to the widespread adoption of meditation, yoga, and incense in households that had previously been organizing their evenings around the television schedule. The Nehru jacket sat inside this broader cultural movement. Wearing one communicated something, a loosening of Western rigidity, an openness to influences from outside the European tailoring tradition, a willingness to reconsider what a jacket was supposed to be. Whether the people wearing Nehru jackets had thought through all of that is another question. Many of them were wearing the jacket because Sammy Davis Jr. wore one to a party, or because it appeared on a television program, or because the boutique on Carnaby Street had them in stock and they looked interesting. Fashion rarely requires philosophical coherence from its participants. What it requires is that enough people wear a thing at the same time and in the same spirit, and for a period of roughly 2 years, enough people were doing exactly that with the Nehru jacket. The decline was swift and almost comedic. By 1970, the Nehru jacket had become a shorthand for a particular kind of 60s excess. Earnest, slightly solemn, spiritually aspirational in a way that the new decade found faintly embarrassing. It became costume before it became vintage, which is fashion's unkindest fate. A garment that cannot be worn without irony has lost the argument. What the Nehru jacket left behind, however, was a permanent loosening of the rules around men's neckwear. The idea that a jacket did not require a lapel, that a collar didn't require a tie, that the throat could simply be the throat, quietly and without acknowledgement, entered the mainstream. You can see it today in every collarless blazer sold in every high street store in the world. The 60s removed the lapel and it never entirely came back. When Yves Saint Laurent introduced Le Smoking, a tuxedo suit designed for women, in 1966, he was not simply releasing a garment. He was detonating a social argument that had been quietly simmering for several decades. Women in trousers were not universally accepted in the early 60s. There are documented accounts of women being turned away from restaurants in America for wearing pantsuits. Nightclubs had policies. Hotels had opinions. The idea that a woman might choose to wear a garment with 2 separate leg openings to a formal dinner was, in certain corners of society, treated not as a style choice but as a kind of philosophical challenge that required an immediate and sometimes quite loud response. Into this atmosphere, the pantsuit arrived, worn by increasingly prominent women, covered approvingly in magazines, and condemned enthusiastically by people who had somehow decided that other people's trousers were their business. The resistance to women in trousers had deep and not entirely rational roots. For centuries the trouser had been coded as male, not because of anything intrinsic to the garment, which is simply 2 tubes of fabric attached at the top, but because of the social agreement that had grown up around it. Breaking that agreement, even by wearing a beautifully tailored pair of wide-leg trousers to dinner, read to certain observers as a form of transgression, not just a fashion choice, but a statement about the nature of womanhood itself. This was, to put it plainly, a great deal of weight to place on a pair of trousers. Saint Laurent's Le Smoking was not the first pantsuit. Women had been wearing trousers in various contexts since at least the 1930s, and the practicalities of the Second World War had introduced them to many women who might otherwise never have encountered them. But Le Smoking was the first pantsuit designed explicitly for formal occasions, styled with a cummerbund and bow tie, intended to be worn to exactly the kinds of events where the argument about women in trousers was most likely to ignite. It was a provocation dressed as evening wear, and it worked. Women who wore it to restaurants were turned away. Some of them came back in skirts, were seated, and then changed in the restroom. Others simply went somewhere else, which is a form of protest that leaves no permanent record but is nonetheless a protest. The model Nan Kempner famously refused entry to a New York restaurant in a Le Smoking pantsuit, removed the trousers in the street, tucked in the jacket, and entered wearing what was now a very short tunic. The restaurant let her in. The story travelled, as stories of that kind do, and became part of the decade's folklore about what women were and were not allowed to wear to dinner. By the end of the decade, the pantsuit had moved from provocation to mainstream. Women in offices wore trouser suits. Women on television wore them. The restaurant policies began, quietly and without ceremony, to dissolve. No announcement was made, no formal acknowledgement that the position had been wrong. The trousers simply became acceptable through sheer repetition. Enough women wore them to enough places that the alternative became too exhausting to maintain. Yves Saint Laurent continued to make Le Smoking in variations for the rest of his career. He called it the only garment a woman needed to be perfectly dressed. What he meant, probably, was that it was the only garment that settled the argument by refusing to have the argument at all and simply walking in. If you wanted to understand the 1960s absolute conviction that the future was approximately 5 years away and would be made entirely of white vinyl, you needed only to look at the work of André Courrèges. The French designer had trained as an engineer before turning to fashion, and it showed. His clothes looked less like clothing and more like load-bearing structures that happened to be wearable. His 1965 collection introduced the world to short hemlines, flat white boots, geometric shapes, and a colour palette so aggressively clean that it made hospital corridors look cosy. Everything was white, or silver, or a white that wanted to be silver when it grew up. The fabrics were stiff, architectural, and refused to drape in any direction that nature might have suggested. Courreges' background in engineering was not merely biographical detail, it shaped every aspect of his design philosophy, where most couturiers thought about drape, flow, and the relationship between fabric and the moving body. Courrèges thought about structure. He wanted his clothes to hold their shape independent of the body inside them. He cut in straight lines. He avoided anything that suggested organic softness. His seams were precise to a degree that required considerable technical skill to execute. The result was clothing that looked, in photographs, like architecture, clean, deliberate, and entirely in command of the space it occupied. The white was non-negotiable. Courrèges believed that the future would be clean, literally, visually clean, in a way that the present was not. He was designing, he said, for women who would live in a new world, efficient, technological, liberated from the fussiness of traditional fashion. White communicated all of this simultaneously. It was the colour of laboratory coats, of space capsules, of the walls of modernist buildings. It said nothing old here, nothing inherited, everything starting fresh. The practical difficulty that white vinyl shows every mark, every scuff, every fingerprint, every brush against a cafe table, was acknowledged and dismissed. The future would presumably find a way to deal with that. His flat boots, which appeared in the same collection as the short hemlines, were the logical footwear complement to everything else he was doing. Low-heeled, rounded at the toe, ending just below the knee, they extended the geometric vocabulary of the clothes downward. They were not shoes that wanted to be noticed for their own sake. They were part of a system. Courreges dressed the body the way an engineer designs a component, each element designed to work with every other element, nothing included for sentiment, nothing left out for tradition. The women who actually wore his clothes reported experiences that range from quietly transformative to quietly uncomfortable. The stiff fabrics didn't move the way the body moves. The geometric cuts that looked immaculate in a photograph required, in the real world, a very specific posture to maintain. Sitting was fine. Standing was excellent. The complicated middle ground, reaching for something on a high shelf, leaning forward, doing anything that required the body to depart from the vertical, was where the architectural dream met its limitations. None of this diminished Courreges' influence, which was enormous and immediate. His 1965 collection was copied within months by manufacturers across Europe and America. The flat white boot and the short geometric dress became the visual shorthand for the entire space-age moment. He had imagined a future and given it a dress code, and for several years the decade wore it, stiffly, brilliantly, and in a colour that showed every single thing that happened to it. In 1966, Spanish-born designer Paco Rabanne staged his first haute couture show in Paris and announced to the assembled fashion press that he intended to use materials that no previous couturier had dared to work with. He was not exaggerating. His debut collection featured dresses assembled from aluminum and rhodoid plastic discs linked together with metal rings, garments that were constructed using pliers rather than sewn with needles and thread, because needles and thread would have been structurally irrelevant. The models wore them. The models walked in them. The dresses clinked. They reflected light in directions that clothing had not previously reflected light. They were, in the most literal possible sense, outfits you could not accidentally pack in a suitcase. Rabanne had trained as an architect before entering fashion, which explains quite a lot about the dress made of metal discs. Architecture concerns itself with structure, with the properties of materials, with how things hold together under load, and Rabanne brought all of this to clothing. He was interested not in fabric but in material. What happened when you made a garment from something that was not traditionally used for garments? He experimented with aluminum, with plastic, with paper, with leather cut in geometric shapes and linked rather than sewn. The dresses that resulted were less garments than constructions, things that existed at the border between fashion and sculpture, and were happy on either side of it. The experience of wearing a Rabanne metal disc dress was, by several accounts, a full sensory event. The discs were cool to the touch when you put the dress on. The ambient temperature of whatever room they'd been sitting in conducted directly to your skin, because the dress itself did not insulate the way fabric does. As you moved, the discs shifted against each other and against you, a constant gentle contact that was somewhere between a massage and a reminder that you were wearing metal. The sound was its own category, a soft, continuous chinking that accompanied every step, every gesture, every turn of the torso. Sitting down in a Rabanne dress required either a very forgiving chair or a willingness to accept that the dress and the chair were going to have a conversation that you were not entirely in control of. Dancing was apparently magnificent. The discs caught and threw light with every movement, turning the wearer into a mobile light installation. The sound, which might have been annoying in a quiet room, was entirely lost on a dance floor. And the movement of the discs against the body, which in stillness could feel like a novelty, in motion became something genuinely sensual. Rabanne's dresses were designed for movement, and in movement they delivered. They were also extraordinarily heavy by the standards of haute couture, where even the grandest ball gowns were engineered to be lifted and worn by a human body without undue difficulty. Metal is not light. Wearing a full Rabanne disc dress for an evening required either excellent posture or, by the end of the event, the kind of resignation that comes from having committed to an adventure and seen it through. Rabanne called his first collection 12 Unwearable Dresses in Contemporary Materials. The fashion press, which had seen a great many things and was rarely surprised, was surprised. The name was a provocation, or perhaps a warning, or perhaps both. The dresses were, in every technical sense, wearable. They were simply wearable in the way that a beautiful and interesting building is inhabitable, with full awareness that it was not designed primarily for your comfort, and a willingness to find that arrangement acceptable. By 1967, two distinct fashion worlds had emerged within the same decade, and they regarded each other with a kind of bewildered suspicion usually reserved for people who pronounce common words very differently. On one side, the mods, the space-age minimalists, the clean geometric lines and white vinyl. On the other, the hippies of Haight-Ashbury, who had taken one look at the structured, futuristic aesthetic and decided the answer was more flowers. Flower power fashion was the sartorial wing of the counterculture movement, a rejection of both mainstream consumerism and the cold technological optimism of space-age design. It involved flowing fabrics, natural fibres, embroidery, fringe, beads, headbands, and prints that appeared to have been designed by someone sitting in a field of wildflowers who was also, possibly, listening to music very loudly. The name flower power came from the poet Allen Ginsberg, who proposed in 1965 that demonstrators at anti-war marches carry flowers rather than placards, a symbolic substitution that communicated the same opposition while reframing it in terms of beauty rather than anger. The idea was adopted enthusiastically by the counterculture, and the flower became the central visual motif of everything the hippie movement produced, wore and displayed. Flowers were worn in the hair, flowers were printed on every available surface of clothing. Flowers were handed to strangers on street corners. If the space age said the future was clean and geometric, flower power said the future was blooming and slightly damp with morning dew, and it was going to smell like patchouli. The clothing itself was a deliberate departure from the manufactured, the synthetic, and the mass-produced. Where mod fashion celebrated the machine-made, flower power fashion celebrated the handmade, or at least the appearance of the handmade. Embroidery on jackets and jeans, tie-dye, which required actual physical effort and produced results that were unique to the specific twist and dye of each individual garment. Crochet tops that had been made by someone who knew how to crochet, or purchased from someone who did. The aesthetic communicated authenticity through imperfection, a garment that was not perfectly symmetrical, that had irregular stitching, that showed the hand of its maker, was more desirable than one that was flawless. The silhouette was the opposite of mod in every dimension. Where mod was short, tight and geometric, flower power was long, loose and organic. Maxi skirts swept the ground. Peasant blouses bloused. Bell-bottom trousers flared from mid-thigh in a way that suggested the wearer's legs were slowly becoming trees. Fabrics were soft, cotton, muslin, velvet, Indian cotton, imported through the same trade routes that were bringing Eastern philosophy to Western living rooms. Everything moved when you moved, which was not incidental. The clothes were designed for a life lived outdoors, at festivals, in open fields, not for an office or a boutique or a restaurant with a dress code that had opinions about trousers. The irony that flower power fashion was quickly mass-produced and sold at scale in department stores, that the aesthetic of anti-consumerism became a consumer product almost immediately, was noted at the time and largely shrugged off. The Summer of Love was, in 1967. By 1968 you could buy a machine-made approximation of it at most major retailers. The counterculture, as countercultures do, was absorbed into the mainstream it had set out to oppose. The flowers remained. The radicalism became a print. It is impossible to understand why the miniskirt existed without understanding the decade that produced it, and it is impossible to understand that decade without acknowledging that in 1960 the birth control pill became available for the first time in the United States. This is not a fashion detail. This is the context in which a fashion detail became something much larger. The miniskirt arrived 5 years after the pill, and while no designer ever held a press conference to say this hemline is a statement about bodily autonomy, the cultural connection was felt immediately and loudly by both those who celebrated it and those who were deeply alarmed by it. Clothing had always communicated something about the wearer's place in society. The miniskirt communicated something specifically about what women planned to do about that. Before the 1960s, women's fashion had operated within a fairly consistent set of assumptions about what a woman's body was for and who was entitled to have opinions about it. Clothing covered, constrained, and contained. The foundation garments of the 1950s, the girdles, the long-line bras, the structured petticoats, were not simply practical choices. They were expressions of a social contract about how a woman's body should be presented in public. Controlled, contained, shaped toward a specific ideal, and held there with considerable engineering. The shift away from all of this, the shift dress, the miniskirt, the pantyhose that replaced the girdle and garter, was not merely aesthetic. It was a renegotiation of the contract. The women who wore miniskirts in 1965 and 1966 were not, in the main, doing so with explicit feminist intent. Many of them were simply following fashion. It was what was in the shops, what was in the magazines, what the girls on Carnaby Street were wearing. But fashion does not require conscious intent to be political. It only requires that enough people make the same choice at the same time, and that the choice means something to those observing it. The miniskirt meant something. To its wearers, it meant freedom of movement, youth, modernity, belonging to a particular moment. To its opponents, it meant something else entirely, and the vehemence of the opposition was itself a kind of confirmation that something significant was happening. The relationship between the pill and the miniskirt was not causal in any simple way. One did not directly produce the other. But they emerged from the same cultural moment, the same loosening of the structures that had governed women's lives and women's bodies for the preceding generation. The pill offered control over reproduction. The miniskirt offered control over presentation. Both were resisted by the same voices, celebrated by many of the same people, and ultimately normalized through the same mechanism. Enough women made the choice that the choice became unremarkable. What is striking in retrospect is how much energy was directed at the miniskirt specifically. How many column inches, how many pulpit minutes, how many dinner table arguments were devoted to the question of what a woman should and should not cover with cloth. The hemline had become a referendum. Not on fashion exactly, but on whether women were going to be the authors of their own self-presentation, or whether that authority was going to be exercised by someone else on their behalf. The miniskirt won the referendum. It did not resolve the underlying question, but it moved the line, quite literally, in the direction of the knee, and some of what it moved was permanent. Nobody who wore a beehive in its full, architecturally committed form simply went to bed at night and woke up with their hair intact. The beehive required maintenance, strategy, and a willingness to approach sleep as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be enjoyed. The construction of a proper beehive, which involved backcombing the hair until it achieved a density and texture similar to a well-stuffed cushion, then pinning and lacquering the whole structure into place with hairspray applied in quantities that would today require a ventilation warning, was not something a woman repeated every morning if she could help it. The solution was to preserve the beehive across multiple days, which required sleeping in positions that protected the structure, often using silk wraps, toilet paper, or in one popular method, a purpose-designed net worn to bed while lying as still as possible. The logistics of sleeping with a beehive were, when you examine them closely, genuinely impressive. The first challenge was the pillow. A standard pillow, receiving the weight of a head topped with a lacquered dome of back-combed hair, would compress the back of the structure and, by morning, leave it lopsided in a way that no amount of touching up could fully correct. The solution varied by practitioner. Some women used very flat pillows, effectively sleeping on the pillow's edge rather than its centre. Others dispensed with the pillow under the head entirely and placed it under the neck instead, keeping the head slightly elevated and the beehive floating clear of contact with any surface. This is the kind of arrangement that sounds manageable when described and becomes profoundly uncomfortable approximately 20 minutes into the actual night. The wrapping strategies are their own chapter. Silk scarves were wound gently around the entire structure before bed, protecting the outer layer of the beehive from the friction of movement against a pillowcase, which is rougher than it sounds when your hair has been lacquered into a specific shape that you would prefer to find intact in the morning. Toilet paper was used by many women as a cheaper alternative to silk, wound in strips around the base and body of the beehive and secured with bobby pins in a way that made the head, in its bedtime configuration, look like something being carefully packaged for a long journey. Purpose-made hair nets, not the delicate evening nets worn decoratively, but the more committed sleeping versions, often made from nylon and shaped to accommodate considerable volume, were the industrial solution. You put your beehive in the net held it, you slept on your side in the position that disturbed the structure least, and you woke up with something that required touch-up rather than reconstruction. Whether you slept particularly well in this configuration is a question the fashion histories do not answer directly, though the answer seems fairly strongly implied. What is remarkable is not that women did this, but that they did it, willingly and often enthusiastically for months and in some cases years at a stretch. The beehive demanded daily negotiation, with the pillow, with the sleeping position, with the morning mirror, with the can of hairspray that needed to be within reach before you were fully awake. It required you to carry the structure of your public self into your private hours, to maintain the performance even in sleep. The beehive was, in this sense, less a hairstyle than a commitment. You did not wear a beehive, you maintained one, and the maintenance never fully stopped. There is a street in London's Soho district, 1 block long, that for approximately 5 years in the 1960s became the most fashionable address on the planet. Carnaby Street in the early part of the decade was not yet remarkable. It was a small, slightly unremarkable back street whose rents were low enough to attract independent retailers willing to try something new. What those retailers tried was mod fashion. Bold, colours, sharp cuts, clothing designed not for the establishment but for young people who had money for the first time and no particular interest in dressing like their parents. By the mid-60s, Carnaby Street had boutiques selling items that would have been unwearable a decade earlier, men's shirts in pink and purple, women's shorts sold as outerwear, boots in colours that did not appear in nature. The economic conditions that made Carnaby Street possible are worth understanding. The post-war generation coming of age in the early 1960s in Britain was, by the standards of the previous generation, relatively prosperous. Full employment, the welfare state, and rising wages meant that working-class young people had disposable income for the first time in any meaningful way, money that was not needed for survival and was available for other purposes. Clothing was one of those purposes. The fashion industry that had previously catered primarily to the middle and upper classes discovered, with some surprise, that there was a large and enthusiastic market among young working-class Londoners who wanted to look good and had money to spend on doing so. John Stephen, a young Scotsman who arrived in London in the 1950s and opened his first menswear shop on Carnaby Street in 1958, understood this before almost anyone else. His shop, his clothes, sold colourful, slim-cut garments at prices that a young man working an ordinary job could actually afford. He kept the prices low by cutting out the middlemen, manufacturing quickly, and turning over stock rapidly, an approach that would later be recognised as an early version of fast fashion, though it was not called that at the time. He was simply responding to demand that existed and had not been served. By the mid-60s, Stephen had several shops on the street, other retailers had followed, and Carnaby Street had become a destination, not just for Londoners but for tourists from across the world who wanted to bring back something that looked like the decade they had read about in magazines. The street appeared in films, in television programmes, in fashion spreads that were distributed internationally. Time magazine declared London the swinging city in 1966, and Carnaby Street was, in many of the accompanying photographs, the evidence. The paradox of Carnaby Street is that its success contained the seed of its decline. The street became famous for being the authentic centre of 60s style, and the fame brought so many people who wanted to participate in that authenticity that the authenticity itself became diluted. By 1968, Carnaby Street was selling souvenirs of itself, clothing designed to look like what Carnaby Street had been a few years earlier, sold to visitors who wanted to take home a piece of something that had already, quietly, moved on. The real action, by that point, had migrated to the King's Road in Chelsea, which was further from the tourist circuit and therefore still capable of the kind of genuine, unself-conscious experimentation that Carnaby Street had pioneered. But Carnaby Street had done its work. In 5 years, on one block, it had established that fashion could come from the street rather than the salon, and that idea did not migrate back with the tourists. It stayed. The word mod, derived from modernist, originally described a subculture that emerged in London in the late 1950s among young working-class people with a very specific set of interests: sharp Italian-influenced tailoring, soul and R&B music, Italian motor scooters, and an absolute refusal to be confused with teddy boys, rockers, or their parents. By the early 60s, mod had evolved into a full aesthetic movement with a recognisable uniform. Fitted jackets, straight-leg trousers, crew-neck jumpers, short skirts, and a posture of effortless cool that required, as most effortless things do, considerable effort. The mod look was clean, precise, and self-conscious in the best possible way, every item chosen deliberately, every hem measured, every collar considered. The early mod was a male phenomenon first. The young men who identified as mods in the late 1950s and early 60s were intensely concerned with clothing in a way that British working-class masculinity had not previously sanctioned. They spent a significant portion of their disposable income on Italian suits, on narrow ties, on shoes with a very specific heel height and toe shape. They went to tailors. They had opinions about the exact width of a lapel. In a culture that had traditionally discouraged male interest in personal appearance as something slightly suspicious, the mods claimed that interest openly and organised an entire subculture around it. The scooter was as important as the suit. The Vespa and the Lambretta, Italian motor scooters that were lighter, cleaner, and more manoeuvrable than the motorcycles preferred by. The rockers, who were the mods' great rivals, were the preferred transport because they did not ruin your clothes. Riding a motorcycle in a good suit was inadvisable. Riding a Vespa in a good suit was possible, and the mods did it with deliberate studied elegance. The scooter also provided mobility, access to clubs in different parts of London, to dance halls, to the places where the music was, and the people who cared about the music were gathered. By the mid-60s, mod had expanded far beyond its working-class London origins. It had been picked up by the fashion industry, by the music industry, by designers like Mary Quant and boutique owners like John Stephen, and transformed into an international aesthetic that bore the marks of its origins without being confined to them. The mod look in 1965, miniskirts, geometric prints, go-go boots, bold graphic patterns, was available to and worn by people who'd never been near Carnaby Street and had no particular interest in Italian motor scooters. This expansion was both mod's greatest success and its dissolution. When a subculture is adopted by the mainstream, it stops being a subculture. The mods who had defined themselves by their difference from everyone else found, by the mid-60s, that everyone else was wearing mod clothing. The response was to push further, toward more extreme tailoring, more unusual colour combinations, more committed versions of the aesthetic that could not be easily mass-produced. But fashion follows, and the mass market followed, and eventually the chase ended in the late 60s psychedelic explosion, which was mod's heir in attitude if not in aesthetic. What the mod movement established permanently was the idea that youth could generate its own culture rather than inheriting one from above. The mods had not waited for the fashion establishment to tell them what to wear. They had decided for themselves, argued among themselves, refined the look through collective effort, and created something genuinely original. That process, subculture as design laboratory, did not end with the 60s. It simply became the way things were done. If you handed Pierre Cardin a human body and asked him what he saw, he would almost certainly tell you he saw a structure that needed organising. The French designer, born in Italy, trained in Paris, operating in a dimension of his own devising, spent the 1960s producing clothing that treated the human form less as something to be flattered and more as a surface to be covered in interesting angles. His collections featured geometric cutouts, sculptural shapes, strange seams that went in directions seams had not previously gone, and an unshakable conviction that fashion should look like it had been sent back in time from an era when everyone had solved the basic problems of existence and moved on to experimenting with their silhouettes. Cardin came to fashion through tailoring, which gave him an unusually precise understanding of construction, of how a garment was put together, where the forces were, which seams bore weight, and which were decorative. He used this knowledge not to produce clothes that were well constructed in the conventional sense, but to experiment with what construction could produce when freed from the obligation to look like anything that had come before. His cut-out dresses, garments with geometric shapes removed from the fabric to expose the skin beneath, were technically demanding to produce. The openings had to be finished in ways that prevented unravelling, had to be placed with precision on the body, had to form shapes that read as intentional rather than accidental. This was not someone cutting holes in a dress. This was someone making a considered argument about where the boundary between covered and uncovered should fall. His use of colour was as decisive as his use of shape. Cardin worked in strong, flat tones, not the swirling mixtures of psychedelic fashion, but single, committed colours that read from a distance as blocks of pure hue. A coat was orange, not orange with an undertone of something else, not a nuanced terracotta, orange as fully and completely as orange could be achieved in fabric. A suit was cobalt blue. The colours communicated the same certainty as the shapes. This is a decision, fully made, not a suggestion. The futurism in Cardin's work was not purely aesthetic. He genuinely believed that clothing was going to change, that the materials, the silhouettes, and the relationship between clothes and the body were all in the process of transformation. He made clothes from bonded jersey, from vinyl, from materials that had not previously been used for couture because couture had not previously considered them appropriate. He designed for men and women with equal commitment, producing collections for both that shared the same geometric vocabulary. He believed and stated plainly that fashion would eventually move away from the biological differences between male and female bodies and toward a universal aesthetic. Whether or not that prediction has proved accurate is a reasonable subject for debate. What Cardin built in the 1960s was a visual language, one that was internally consistent, immediately recognizable, and confident enough to ask the person wearing it to commit entirely. His clothes did not work in combination with clothing from other designers. They were a system, not a wardrobe, and participating in the system meant accepting its terms completely. Looking at the photographs now, the circular cutouts, the asymmetric hems, the bold single-colour volumes, what is most striking is how seriously the decade took its own ambitions. Pierre Cardin was not making clothes for people to wear to the supermarket. He was designing a future in which the supermarket might itself look different. Whether that future arrived is one question. Whether the clothes were extraordinary is not a question at all. While one half of the 1960s was busy constructing paper dresses and chrome accessories, the other half was pulling on a flannel shirt, picking up an acoustic guitar and heading to a coffee shop in Greenwich Village. The folk revival of the early part of the decade, centred on artists like Joan Baez, Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary, brought with it a fashion sensibility that was the deliberate opposite of everything happening on Carnaby Street and in the Paris ateliers. Where mod was sharp and geometric, folk was soft and natural. Where space-age fashion reached for the future, folk looked back toward traditional crafts, handmade textiles, and a studied simplicity that communicated authenticity rather than style. The folk revival was, at its core, a political and cultural movement that happened to have a dress code. The young people who gathered in coffee houses and march routes in the early 60s were not primarily thinking about fashion. They were thinking about civil rights, about the nuclear arms race, about the gap between the America they had been promised and the America they were actually living in. But clothing communicates even when the wearer is thinking about something else. And the clothing of the folk revival communicated very clearly. I am not interested in the things Madison Avenue is selling. I am interested in something older and more honest than that. For women, this meant long straight hair worn without the elaborate architecture of the beehive or the bouffant, simply combed, sometimes parted in the middle, falling past the shoulders in a way that required no products and no infrastructure. It meant dark turtlenecks and simple blouses, denim skirts and flat leather sandals. The absence of ornament was itself the statement. In a decade when the fashion industry was producing increasingly elaborate constructions, the space-age helmet hat, the beehive, the structured mod shift, choosing to wear nothing on your head and something plain on your body was a form of dissent that was legible to everyone who saw it. For men, the folk look was equally deliberate in its plainness. Work shirts in chambray or flannel, denim jeans worn not as a fashion choice but as the garment you wore when you were not performing, jeans as the absence of costume rather than a costume in themselves, boots that were practical rather than decorative, the beard in certain cases which communicated a willingness to look unkempt in a decade that, in many of its other expressions, was deeply concerned with looking a very specific kind of polished. Joan Baez was the visual icon of the folk aesthetic in the way that Twiggy was the visual icon of mod, a single face and silhouette that condensed the entire sensibility into one immediately readable image. Where Twiggy communicated the future, Baez communicated the past, or rather, a vision of the past that was clean, principled, and entirely free of the complications of the present. Her long dark hair, her simple clothing, her lack of visible effort were aspirational in the same way that any fashion icon's look is aspirational, even while the look itself was arguing against aspiration. The folk aesthetic fed directly into the hippie movement of the mid to late 60s, which inherited its suspicion of mainstream fashion and its preference for natural materials, but added colour, embroidery, and a considerably more festive attitude towards self-presentation. The flannel shirt became the embroidered blouse, the dark turtleneck became the printed Indian cotton tunic, the studied simplicity became studied abundance, but the underlying argument that what you wore should say something real about who you were remained constant. The folk revival planted it. The counterculture grew it into something that covered considerably more ground and considerably more fabric. One of the great underreported stories of 1960s fashion is the extraordinary scale of the wig and hairpiece industry, which by the middle of the decade had become a serious consumer market with its own magazines, retail chains, and something approximating a support community. The decade's obsession with extreme hairdos, the beehive, the bouffant, the geometric bob, and later the enormous volumes of the late 60s, created a practical problem. Not everyone's actual hair could be coaxed into these shapes without assistance. The solution was to supplement hairpieces, falls, long sections of hair that could be clipped to the back of the head to add length and volume, and full wigs became mainstream accessories sold in department stores alongside handbags and gloves. The logic was straightforward, even if the implementation was occasionally not. If the fashionable hairstyle of the moment required more hair than you actually had, or hair of a texture your hair was not, or a colour your hair declined to become, the answer was to acquire the necessary hair from another source and attach it to your head. This had been done in various forms throughout history. The elaborately powdered wigs of the 18th century were not so different in principle, but the 60s democratized the practice. Wigs were no longer the province of actresses, theatrical performers, or the extremely wealthy. They were available in synthetic fibres at prices that an ordinary working woman could manage, in colours and styles that rotated with the seasons. The synthetic wig was a genuinely new technology in the 1960s, and like most new technologies, it had both advantages and limitations. On the advantage side, it was inexpensive, it held its style without setting, it could be washed and dried in a fraction of the time required for human hair, and it was available in colours that human hair did not naturally produce. On the limitation side, it looked, in certain lights and at certain distances, like synthetic fibre arranged to resemble hair. The tell was usually movement, or rather the absence of it. A synthetic wig moved as a unit in a way that natural hair, which moves strand by strand, does not. In still photographs, the effect was manageable. In motion, the experienced observer could generally identify what they were looking at. Falls, hairpieces rather than full wigs, were used differently and often more successfully. A fall was clipped beneath the crown of the natural hair, adding length at the back while the natural hair was visible at the front, creating the impression of a single integrated hairstyle. In the mid-60s, when the fashionable look for women moved away from the constructed beehive and toward longer, straighter hair worn closer to the head, falls became a way to achieve the length that the fashion required without waiting for your actual hair to grow it. The effect, done well, was convincing. It required the clip to be concealed by the natural hair above it, and the fall itself to match both the colour and texture of the wearer's own hair, conditions that were met more reliably as the technology improved. The wig and hairpiece market reached its peak in the late 1960s, when volume hairstyles, enormous, rounded, architectural shapes that bore no relationship to what any individual head of hair could naturally produce, were at the height of their fashion. By the early 1970s, as fashion moved toward more natural aesthetics, and longer natural hair became the ideal, the market contracted. But the infrastructure it had built, the retail chains, the styling techniques, the cultural normalization of wearing hair that was not your own, remained. The fake hair industrial complex, having established itself in the 60s, did not go away. It simply diversified. Somewhere around 1968 and 1969, fashion did something unexpected. It looked at the miniskirt, the metal disc dress, the paper gown, and the white vinyl boot, and decided it had perhaps overcorrected. The late 60s brought the maxi dress and the midi skirt, long flowing hemlines that fell to the ankle or mid-calf, often made from natural fabrics, often in earthy or jewel tones, often with embroidery, fringing, or other details borrowed from non-Western textile traditions. It was as if the decade had sprinted toward the future for 6 years, arrived, found it chilly and a bit clinical, and decided to come back wearing something warm. The shift was not universal or immediate. Minis and maxis coexisted for several years in a state of genuine hemline conflict, but the direction was clear. The arrival of the maxi was, in fashion terms, genuinely surprising. Hemlines had been moving upward for the entire decade with such consistency and momentum that the fashion press had largely stopped noting each individual increment and simply assumed the direction would continue until it reached some unspecified but presumably very high destination. The sudden reversal, dresses to the floor, skirts to. The mid-calf, a return to coverage at the very moment when coverage had seemed definitively obsolete, was not anticipated by most industry observers, and the reaction was divided. Some women embraced the maxi immediately and with relief. The miniskirt, whatever its cultural significance, had required daily management in a way that a long skirt did not. Sitting down, getting out of cars, climbing stairs, walking into wind, all of these ordinary activities had required, in a miniskirt, a level of planning that was exhausting over time. The maxi offered freedom of movement in a different register. The freedom to walk, sit, and exist in public without strategic calculation. It also offered warmth, which particularly in the northern European and American climates where the miniskirt had been most enthusiastically adopted, was not a negligible advantage. Others resisted. Women who had organised their wardrobes and their self-image around the miniskirt found the maxi's arrival threatening, in a way that was not entirely about aesthetics. The fashion industry's sudden insistence that legs should be covered again felt to some like a reversal of the freedoms the miniskirt had represented, a return to concealment dressed up as a new trend. The hemline wars of 1969 and 1970, in which women made public and sometimes organised declarations of where their hems would and would not fall, were the fashion equivalent of a genuine political argument. The hemline had become, over the course of the decade, a loaded symbol, and changing it was not a neutral act. The maxi itself came in 2 distinct versions that coexisted uneasily. There was the hippie maxi, made from Indian cotton or cheesecloth, worn with flat sandals and embroidered details, floor-length and moving gently in whatever breeze was available, carrying the sensibility of flower power into a new silhouette. And there was the fashion industry maxi, structured, sometimes dramatically cut, worn, with heeled boots or platforms, appearing in glossy magazines as the next deliberate statement, rather than as the organic expression of a counterculture. The 2 versions shared a hemline and almost nothing else. What the late 60s maxi demonstrated above all was that the decade had been in genuine conversation with itself about what women's clothing was for and what it should communicate. The miniskirt had made one argument, the maxi made a different one. The fact that both arguments were being made simultaneously by women who held them with equal conviction is perhaps the most honest thing the decade's fashion said about the decade itself. It contained multitudes, and it wore them all at once. Mary Quant did not simply design clothes. She designed a category, the idea that young women deserved their own fashion, made for their bodies and their lives, priced for their budgets, and sold in spaces that did not feel like visiting a bank. Her London boutique, Bazaar, opened on the King's Road in Chelsea in 1955, just before the decade that would make her famous, and it was from the beginning deliberately different. The clothes were colourful, the music was loud, the atmosphere was alive in a way that department store fashion floors were not. Quant understood something that older fashion houses had missed. There was a generation of young women coming of age who had spending power and no particular desire to dress like their mothers. The fashion establishment of the 1950s centred on Paris couture, filtered down through department stores and dressmaking patterns To the ordinary consumer, operated on a set of assumptions that Quant found entirely wrong for the moment. The assumption that fashion moved from older women to younger ones. The assumption that formal occasions were the primary context for which clothes should be designed. The assumption that quality meant expensive, that expense meant exclusive, and that exclusivity was desirable. Quant rejected all of these premises not as a philosophical position but as a commercial observation. The young women she knew were not buying the fashion that existed, and they were not buying it because it was not designed for them. Bazaar sold clothes that were not available anywhere else, garments that Quant and her husband Alexander Plunkett Green had made specifically for the shop, in styles that no manufacturer was yet producing. The skirts were shorter than anything on the market. The colours were bolder, the shapes were simpler and more graphic. The prices were low enough that a working young woman could buy something new without planning the purchase for weeks in advance. The shop stayed open late and played music, which was not how fashion retail operated in 1955, but turned out to be how young women who worked all day and wanted to shop in the evening preferred to experience it. Quant's design philosophy was practical in the most straightforward sense. She wanted clothes that women could actually move in, could walk fast in, could sit on the underground in, could dance in at the end of the day without changing. This sounds modest as an ambition until you consider how many garments in the 1950s did not meet these criteria. The structured suits, the full petticoated skirts, the pencil skirts that made a normal stride impossible. Fashion had been optimizing for the appearance of a woman standing still. Quant was designing for a woman in motion. Her influence on the wider fashion industry was in the end more significant than any individual garment she produced. The miniskirt is credited to her, fairly or not. The credit has stuck. But the more lasting contribution was the model of fashion retail she invented. The boutique, as a format, small, specialized, selling a distinct point of view rather than a range of options, addressed to a specific customer rather than a general public, was essentially created at Bazaar and spread from there to Carnaby Street to the King's Road, and eventually to every high street in the English-speaking world. She also understood, earlier than almost anyone in the industry, that young women were not a niche market temporarily inhabiting youth before growing into the real consumer. They were the market. The future of fashion was going to be designed around them, or it was going to be designed around the wrong people. The 1960s proved her right. Every fashion movement that followed, every streetwear brand, every fast fashion retailer, every designer who builds a collection around the taste of someone under 25 is, in some sense, her heir. In 1965, a 22-year-old woman from California named Edie Sedgwick arrived in New York, walked into Andy Warhol's factory, and proceeded to become one of the most copied images of the decade. Her look, cropped platinum hair, enormous eyes ringed in heavy black liner, dangling chandelier, earrings, and a wardrobe that consisted largely of oversized sweaters worn as mini dresses and tights in colours that suggested she had made them herself, was immediately and widely imitated. This was unusual because Sedgwick was not a fashion designer, a model in the traditional sense, or someone who had studied at a fashion school. She was simply someone whose personal aesthetic arrived at exactly the moment when the culture was ready to receive it. The factory was, by 1965, the most culturally electrified space in New York, possibly in America. Andy Warhol's studio on East 47th Street attracted artists, musicians, socialites, drag queens, filmmakers, poets, and anyone else whose existence was sufficiently interesting or sufficiently strange to merit inclusion in Warhol's expanding catalogue of the remarkable. Sedgwick arrived with a recommendation from a mutual friend, became Warhol's companion and on-screen muse, and within months was appearing in the gossip columns as the girl everyone was watching. What she wore to be watched in was, by the standards of the fashion industry unusual. The chandelier earrings, long, dramatic, inherited or borrowed or sourced from somewhere outside the official channels of accessory retail, swung to her shoulders from ears that were otherwise bare. The heavy black liner was applied not just to the upper lid but underneath, creating dark, defined circles that made the eyes appear enormous and slightly theatrical. The hair was platinum, bleached to match Warhol's own silver wig, a pairing that was either coincidental or deliberate, and somehow remained ambiguous. And the sweater as dress, a large knit pulled over tights, extending to mid-thigh or slightly below, worn without a skirt beneath it, was the kind of styling choice that looks accidental, until you realise how precisely it communicated a very specific kind of casual confidence. The imitation was swift and not entirely expected. Fashion magazines that had been covering the structured mod look and the space-age aesthetic suddenly found themselves publishing features on the downtown New York underground scene, in which Sedgwick was the organising image. Girls cut their hair short and bleached it. They extended their eyeliner below the lower lid. They borrowed their boyfriend's sweaters and wore them as dresses and pretended this was not the case. The chandelier earring, which had been available in vintage and costume jewellery stores without generating particular excitement, became something that women were actively seeking out. What Sedgwick represented beyond her specific aesthetic choices was the possibility of a fashion that came entirely from the self, unmediated by designers, by editors, by the official channels through which style was normally transmitted. She'd not been told to look the way she looked. She was not being paid to represent a label or a point of view. She was simply appearing as herself, and the self she appeared as happened to be visually extraordinary and culturally perfectly timed. The factory look, if it can be called that, given how emphatically individual its components were, influenced the late 60s move toward personal styling as distinct from fashion in the industry sense. The idea that a person's look should express something about who they actually were, rather than simply demonstrating awareness of current trends, gathered momentum through the decade and became the central aesthetic argument of the 70s. Edie Sedgwick did not survive to see it arrive. She died in 1971 at 28. But the argument she embodied continued, with considerable force, without her. The miniskirt receives most of the credit for the revolution in women's clothing in the 1960s, which is fair, because it was the most visible component. But there is an argument to be made, a very practical, structural argument, that the miniskirt could not have become a mass-market phenomenon without the simultaneous arrival of pantyhose. Before 1960, women's leg coverage was provided by stockings held up by garter belts or girdles, undergarments that were structured, visible when briefly glimpsed, and not designed to be worn with hemlines that ended several inches above the knee. The logistics simply did not work. Pantyhose, which merged the stocking with an integrated waistband and eliminated the need for garters entirely, arrived in the early 60s and was embraced with a speed that suggested it had been needed for some time. The garter belt and stocking system that pantyhose replaced was not, by the early 1960s, considered particularly inconvenient by the women who wore it. It was simply what stockings were and had always been, and the question of whether there might be a better arrangement had not yet been widely asked. Stockings attached to garters, garters attached to a belt or girdle, the whole assembly sitting around, the hips and upper thighs in a way that was functional, if not particularly comfortable. In winter this was manageable, in summer it was less so, and in a miniskirt, a garment whose hemline fell at exactly the point where the garter and stocking attachment became visible, it was an entirely different problem. The pantyhose resolved this with an elegant simplicity that made the previous arrangement seem, in retrospect, bizarrely overcomplicated. One garment, no attachments, no clips, no buckles, no elastic straps that could and did leave marks on the skin above them. You put them on from the waist down. They covered everything they needed to cover, and you did not need to think about them again until they ran, which they did, often and dramatically at the most inconvenient possible moments. The run was the Pantyhose's great vulnerability and the source of a particular form of daily anxiety that women of the 1960s navigated with various strategies of differing effectiveness. A run in a stocking in the era of garter belts was a problem confined to one leg. You replaced the single stocking. A run in pantyhose was a problem for the entire garment, which had to be discarded and replaced. Women carried spare pairs in their handbags. Clear nail polish, applied to the end of a run, was believed to stop it progressing, a belief that was partially true under certain conditions and entirely useless under others. The moment of discovering a run was a minor catastrophe with a very specific emotional texture. Visible, slightly humiliating, and impossible to hide. Despite this, pantyhose won the argument completely. By the mid-60s, they were the dominant form of leg covering for women in Western markets, and stockings with garters had moved into the category of either specialist lingerie or theatrical costume. The girdle, which had previously been a necessary component of the stocking system, lost its mandatory status along with the garters, another layer of infrastructure removed. Another item of clothing that had previously been considered essential quietly reclassified as optional. The pantyhose also came in colours, which the stocking system had not easily accommodated. White pantyhose with white go-go boots. Black pantyhose with a graphic mod shift. Patterned pantyhose in geometric prints or swirling colours that turn the leg itself into part of the outfit rather than a neutral surface below it. The leg, freed by the pantyhose from the management required by the garter system, became a canvas. The 60s found this arrangement entirely satisfactory and proceeded to cover it in every pattern currently available. By the mid-1960s, something genuinely new was happening in certain corners of fashion. Clothing was increasingly being designed and worn without a strict designation of whose body it was intended for. This was not entirely without precedent. Women had been borrowing from menswear since at least the 1920s, but the scale and the deliberateness of it in the 60s was different. Both Carnaby Street boutiques and American youth fashion began producing garments explicitly labelled as unisex, or simply sold on the same racks without distinction. Men's trousers and women's trousers began to converge in cut. Turtlenecks were worn by everyone. Certain jackets, certain boots, certain bags crossed the line and stayed there. The cultural forces driving the unisex trend were related to, but not identical with, the feminist arguments that were becoming increasingly visible in the same period. Feminism was concerned with equality in the structural sense, in law, in the workplace, in the distribution of domestic labour. Unisex fashion was concerned with something more specific and more surface level. Whether the clothes men and women wore needed to be as different as they had historically been. These questions were related. Both challenged the naturalness of existing gender arrangements, but they were not the same question, and the people most enthusiastic about unisex fashion were not always the same people most engaged in feminist organising. The practical appeal of unisex clothing was real, and not entirely ideological. A garment designed to fit a range of body types without gender designation is, in principle, a more efficient piece of product development than two garments designed separately for two designated markets. The turtleneck, a simple ribbed tube of fabric with a rolled collar, required no modification to work equally well on any body. The same was true of jeans, of certain knitwear, of simple cotton shirts in larger sizes. The genius of unisex was partly the discovery that a great many garments that had been sold separately were actually the same garment under different marketing. The resistance, where it existed, was partly aesthetic and partly something older and less articulable. Men who found themselves browsing racks alongside women's clothing, or women who were offered garments that made no reference to their specific body, experienced responses that range from liberation to mild disorientation, depending on how thoroughly they had previously organised their sense of self around their clothing's clear gender designation. For many people, what they wore was closely connected to who they understood themselves to be, and a garment that declined to make that connection explicit was, at minimum, asking them to make it themselves. The unisex trend of the 60s did not dissolve gender difference in fashion. It had not done so by the end of the decade and has not done so since. What it did was establish that the binary was not fixed, that clothing could inhabit the space between or simply decline to take a position, and that this was commercially viable. The market for gender-neutral clothing that emerged decades later, the streetwear labels, the high fashion houses that began producing genderless collections in the 21st century, was not invented from nothing. It was built on a foundation that Carnaby Street boutiques poured in the middle of the 1960s, when someone put a rack of turtlenecks in the middle of the shop floor and decided not to label either end. There is a generation that received its first glimpse of the 1960s not through personal experience, but through the images that appeared on a television screen, and those images shaped the decade's aesthetic in ways that are difficult to overstate. By the early 1960s, television had become the dominant mass medium in the United States, and was growing rapidly in the United Kingdom and Europe. Fashion programming, not yet its own genre, but increasingly present in variety shows, talk programs and news features, meant that a style emerging from a boutique on the King's Road in London on a Monday could be visible to millions of viewers across the Atlantic by the end of the week. The speed of cultural transmission changed, and fashion changed with it. Before television, fashion spread through magazines, through film, and through the slow diffusion of styles from major cities to smaller ones, a process that could take months or years, and was highly dependent on the economic and geographic circumstances of the person at the receiving end. A woman in a small town in Ohio might see a Vogue photograph of a garment from a Paris collection and understand intellectually that it represented the current direction of fashion, while also understanding that it would be 18 months before anything resembling it appeared in the stores she had access to. The gap between what fashion was and what was actually available was a permanent feature of the pre-television landscape. Television compressed that gap. The variety shows that dominated primetime schedules on both sides of the Atlantic, the Ed Sullivan Show in America, Ready, Steady, Go and Top of the Pops in Britain, featured performers whose clothing was visible in detail to anyone watching, and those performers were wearing the latest things. When the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964, wearing their collarless Pierre Cardin influenced jackets, approximately 73 million Americans saw what a fashionable British man's jacket looked like in the year 1964. The following morning, the demand for that jacket began. Within weeks, American manufacturers were producing versions of it. The feedback loop between performance, television broadcast, viewer desire, and retail production had been shortened to something approaching real time. Go-go dancers on television programs created the same effect for women's fashion. The dancers on Hullabaloo and Shindig, American music variety shows that aired in the mid-60s, wore miniskirts and go-go boots and danced in ways that put those garments in constant motion and constant visibility. Every girl watching understood immediately what the look was, could identify every component of it, and knew where to start if she wanted to assemble it. The informational barrier that had previously separated fashion from its potential audience had been removed. The relationship between television and fashion was not simply one of transmission, however. Television also shaped what fashion looked like, because fashion had to work on a screen. Garments that were subtle, that relied on texture or drape, or the specific quality of a fabric in person, were lost on the small, low-resolution screens of the 1960s. What read on television was graphic, bold, high contrast, exactly the aesthetic that mod fashion had developed for its own reasons. The coincidence between what television could show and what mod fashion actually looked like may not have been entirely coincidental. The medium and the movement understood each other. By the end of the decade, fashion and television had become mutually dependent in ways that neither could have predicted at the start of it. The industry needed the screen needed the spectacle, and the viewer, sitting at home in whatever she was actually wearing, watched the negotiation between them, and made her own decisions accordingly. For most of the 20th century up to the 1960s, the direction of fashion flowed from the top down. Paris couture houses designed for wealthy clients. Those designs were reported on and imitated, and eventually diluted versions reached the mass market, sometimes years later. The 60s disrupted this pipeline in several ways simultaneously. Mary Quant was selling directly to young women in her boutique before any major house had registered what she was doing. American manufacturers were producing ready-to-wear collections of genuine quality and originality. The youth culture was setting trends that the establishment was scrambling to follow rather than lead, and the traditional couture client, wealthy, mature, conservative in her fashion demands, was becoming less central to the cultural conversation about what people were wearing. The couture system at its height was a remarkable and remarkably fragile structure. A major Paris house, Dior, Balenciaga, Chanel, would produce 2 collections per year, shown to buyers and press in formal presentations. The garments were made to order for individual clients, fitted to their specific measurements, often requiring multiple visits for alterations. The price of a couture garment was, and remains, extraordinary, not because the fabric or even the labour justifies it in any ordinary accounting sense, but because what is being purchased is not simply a dress. It is a dress made specifically for you by the atelier of a named designer, in a tradition of craftsmanship that is itself the product. The customer for this experience was wealthy, knew she was wealthy, and wore the garment partly as a demonstration of both. By the early 1960s, that customer was beginning to seem like a relic, not because she had disappeared, but because the cultural conversation had moved on from her. The magazines that had previously devoted their pages to haute couture were increasingly covering ready-to-wear. The designers who were generating the most cultural excitement, Mary Quant in London, Rudi Gernreich in America, the space-age designers with their vinyl and their aluminum, were not working in the couture tradition at all. They were making clothes that could be reproduced in multiples, sold at accessible prices, and worn by women who had never set foot in an atelier. The couture houses responded in different ways. Some, like Chanel, dismissed the new directions entirely and continued doing what they had always done, with the confidence that quality would outlast novelty. Others attempted to adapt, producing ready-to-wear lines alongside their couture collections, licensing their names to manufacturers, reaching for the younger audience without entirely abandoning the older one. Some of these attempts were graceful. Others produced the particular awkwardness of an institution trying to be something it is not, and producing work that satisfies neither its original purpose nor its new ambition. What the 60s established permanently was the principle that fashion's centre of gravity could be located somewhere other than a Paris atelier. The revolution was not complete by 1969, Paris couture continued and continues, but the monopoly was broken. Ready-to-wear was no longer a dilution of the real thing. In many contexts, ready-to-wear was the real thing, and the cultural authority that had previously been the exclusive property of a handful of French houses began to distribute itself across a much wider geography: London, New York, Milan, and a much wider range of price points. The customer who had been told for decades that fashion came from Paris and was handed down to her looked up in the 1960s and discovered that it was also coming from a boutique on the King's Road, from a television programme, from a girl on a street corner in Haight-Ashbury, and that the thing those sources were producing was, by any honest measure, just as relevant to her actual life. The hierarchy did not collapse. It simply became optional. There is something almost poignant about the 1960s fashion archive when you look at it now, not because it was ahead of its time, which it sometimes was, but because of how absolutely, unshakably certain it was. Every silhouette, every material choice, every geometric cutout and vinyl boot and paper dress was made with the conviction that this was correct, that this was the future arriving on schedule, that the past was done, that everything from here onward would be white and clean and structured and free and long-hemmed and short-hemmed, simultaneously, depending on what month it was and which half of the culture you belonged to. The 60s dressed, itself not with doubt, but with a kind of ecstatic confidence that has not been replicated since, possibly because the 70s arrived, looked at the closets the 60s had left behind, and had serious questions. What the decade's fashion reveals, when you look across all of it at once, is that the 60s was not one thing. It was a decade in argument with itself, between the mod and the hippie, the space age and the folk revival, the miniskirt and the maxi, the geometric and the organic, the synthetic and the natural. What looked from a distance like a unified aesthetic moment was, from the inside, a running negotiation between several completely incompatible ideas about what the future should look like and who it should belong to. The clothes were the argument made visible, and unlike most arguments, this one was genuinely interesting to watch. The legacy is complicated in ways that the participants did not fully anticipate. The miniskirt, which arrived as liberation, became a standard that was in its own way as prescriptive as what it replaced. The hippie aesthetic, which set out to reject consumerism, was commodified with startling speed. The space-age designs, which promised a future of clean technology and rational beauty, ended up looking, from the vantage point of the actual technological future, rather more like the past than anyone had planned. The paper dress, designed for disposability, marketed as a solution to the problems of the wardrobe, turned out to be a preview of a broader disposability and fashion that would eventually become its own environmental crisis. And yet the 60s produced things that were genuinely and permanently good. It produced Mary Quant's commercial insight that young women deserved their own fashion. It produced the pantsuit and the slow, grinding normalization of women wearing trousers wherever they chose. It produced the mod aesthetic, which remains one of the most visually coherent and satisfying design movements of the 20th century. It produced Twiggy's face, and Edie Sedgwick's earrings, and Paco Rabanne's impractical, magnificent dresses, all of which remain as strange and as compelling as they were when they were new. What the 60s could not produce was resolution. The arguments it started about whose body fashion should serve, about whether clothing should be practical or spectacular, about whether the future was something to dress toward or something to dress against, did not end with the decade. They continued in different forms through every decade that followed. The hemline is still a political statement depending on the context. The argument about whose aesthetic gets to be the default is still ongoing. The question of whether fashion is liberation or constraint, or both simultaneously, has not been answered. The decade that wore the most astonishing things turned out to be asking the most enduring questions. It just asked them in white vinyl on a street in London while, walking very quickly and making an extraordinary amount of noise. You cannot ask for more than that. Well, you can. But the 60s would have worn it anyway. For the women who came of age in the 1950s, the girdle was not a choice. It was an assumption, a foundational undergarment worn daily by virtually every adult woman in the Western world, regardless of her size, her age, or her personal feelings on the matter of having her midsection compressed by a thick tube of elastic and nylon before she'd finished her morning coffee. The girdle held the stockings up. The girdle smoothed the line of the skirt. The girdle communicated through its very presence beneath the clothing that the body inside was being managed, shaped toward an ideal, disciplined into compliance, presented to the world in its best possible configuration. The 1960s looked at the girdle, looked at the generation of young women it was being handed to, and began a quiet, largely undocumented, but extremely determined campaign to get rid of it. The campaign did not announce itself. There was no girdle-burning moment, no organised protest, no manifesto distributed to department stores demanding that the foundation garment section be closed. What happened instead was subtler and more decisive. The conditions that had made the girdle necessary simply changed one by one until the girdle itself had nothing left to do. The shift dress, which required no particular waist definition, removed the first condition. A garment cut in a straight line from shoulder to hem did not benefit from a cinched and smoothed midsection the way a fitted skirt did. The girdle that had been essential under a pencil skirt became redundant under a shift, and redundancy, in fashion, is a form of death. Young women who had never been particularly enthusiastic about wearing a corset-adjacent undergarment to begin with, discovered, with the shift dress, that they did not have to. The line of the dress did not require it. The mirror did not demand it. They left the girdle in the drawer. Pantyhose delivered the second blow, the garter belt and stocking system that had made the girdle structurally necessary, the girdle holding the garters holding the stockings, the whole assembly operating as an interconnected load-bearing undergarment, became obsolete the moment Pantyhose arrived with its own integrated waistband. You did not need a girdle to hold up Pantyhose. They held themselves up. The architectural function the girdle had served for 2 decades was made instantly redundant by a single garment costing a fraction of the price. What was left, once the functional justifications were removed, was the aesthetic one. The belief that a woman's stomach should be, through whatever means necessary, flat, smooth, and contained. This belief did not disappear with the girdle. It has not disappeared yet. But in the 1960s it lost its mandatory status. The body beneath the shift, dress was the wearer's own business. Whether she chose to manage it with foundation garments or not was increasingly her decision rather than the fashion system's requirement. The generation of women who abandoned the girdle in the 60s did so without making a particularly large announcement about it, which may be why it does not appear in the fashion histories as prominently as the miniskirt or the pantsuit. But the absence of a garment can be as significant as its presence. The girdle's disappearance from the daily routine of millions of women represented something real, the withdrawal of one specific daily physical reminder that the body as it naturally existed was not quite good enough. The stomach that had been held in for a decade was allowed finally to breathe, and it did, with considerable relief, into the waistband of a pair of pantyhose, on its way to work in a shift dress that did not care what shape it was. If the 1960s had a governing principle for accessories, it was this. Whatever the previous decade had done, do it more. Bigger, bolder, more geometrically committed, more willing to occupy space that the face had previously considered its own. The sunglasses of the 1960s are the purest expression of this principle. Lenses so large they redrew the proportions of the human head, frames so aggressively shaped that wearing them was less an act of sun protection than a declaration of personality conducted at the level of the eyebrow. You did not put on a pair of 1960s sunglasses, you put on a position. The sunglasses of the early part of the decade were already larger than what had come before. Cat-eye frames, which had been fashionable in the late 50s, gave way to rounder, more geometric shapes that sat lower on the face and covered more of it. But it was the mid-60s that produced the truly ambitious specimens. The oversized circular lenses associated with the modern space-age movements, tinted into pale colours, yellow, blue, rose, that turned the world a different shade without making it significantly harder to see through. The frames were white, or black, or chrome, or sometimes a plastic so aggressively coloured that it competed with whatever the wearer's outfit was doing, and usually won. The practical function of sunglasses, protecting the eyes from ultraviolet radiation, reducing glare in bright conditions, was not the primary concern of the people who designed or purchased the versions being sold in 1966 boutiques. A lens the size of a small side plate provides excellent coverage, technically speaking, but the enthusiasm with which 60s sunglasses expanded beyond the orbit of the eye owed more to aesthetics than to ophthalmology. The large lens made the face look smaller, the cheekbones more prominent, the expression more inscrutable. Behind a sufficiently large pair of tinted lenses, you could be anywhere and feeling anything, and nobody looking at you would be able to tell. Jacqueline Kennedy understood this before almost anyone else in public life. Her preference for large, dark, round sunglasses, worn at a period of profound personal grief following the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, turned the oversized lens into something it had not previously been. A symbol of dignified privacy, of a public face maintained at great personal cost. The sunglasses she wore in those photographs communicated simultaneously that she was present, and that her interior was not available for inspection. The fashion industry, watching, understood that a lens that could do that was not merely an accessory, it was a tool. The accessories that accompanied the sunglasses in the 60s followed the same logic of amplification. Earrings grew. In the early part of the decade, the small pearl or diamond stud maintained its position, but by the mid-60s, earrings had expanded into geometric shapes, large circles, angular drops, abstract forms in white plastic or metal, that moved when the wearer moved and caught the light in ways that smaller jewellery could not. Bags became more sculptural, their shapes increasingly architectural, boxes, cylinders, hard-sided structures that sat on the arm like a modernist object, rather than a soft receptacle for personal effects. The belt, the scarf, the hat, every accessory participated in the decade's general commitment to being noticed. The hat in particular underwent a decade of identity crisis, moving from the obligatory head covering of the 1950s through the space-age helmet and the floppy, wide-brimmed hippie version, uncertain of its function but confident in its presence. By the end of the 60s, the hat had not resolved its crisis. It had simply made it larger and worn it with conviction and hoped that confidence would carry the day. In the 1960s, it almost always did, and so here you are, on the other side of the 1960s, having survived, at least in your imagination, a decade that dressed itself in aluminum discs and paper dresses and white vinyl boots and geometric cutouts and beehives, so structurally ambitious they required their own maintenance schedule. A decade that shortened the skirt, lengthened it again, removed the lapel, added the flower, abolished the girdle, invented the pantsuit, and then looked at all of it and said, yes, this is exactly right, and also possibly, we may have overdone it slightly. Because here is what is true about the people who lived inside all of that. They were not performing absurdity. They were not dressing up for a joke. Every woman who wrapped her beehive in toilet paper before bed and lay very still in the dark to preserve the structure until morning was doing something genuinely human. She was trying, with the tools available to her, to present herself to the world in the way she wanted to be seen. Every young man who walked into a Carnaby Street boutique and came out, wearing a purple paisley shirt he had never in his life considered wearing before, was doing the same thing. The clothes were strange. The impulse behind them was not strange at all. The 1960s asked, through its fashion, a set of questions that were actually about something, about who got to decide what a woman should cover and what she should show, about whether the future was something to dress toward or something to be suspicious of, about whether clothing could be political or practical or both at once or neither, about whether a young person from a working-class street in London had as much right to set the terms of style as a designer in a Paris atelier. The answers were not clean. The arguments continued past the decade's end and in some form continue now. But the questions were good ones, and the decade had the courage to wear them. So tonight, as you sink a little further into your very comfortable bed, a bed that does not contain straw, a bed whose mattress does not crunch, a bed where nothing is required of you except sleep, maybe spare a quiet thought for the women of the 1960s, the ones who balanced beehives on their pillows, the ones who walked into restaurants in pantsuits and were turned away and came back anyway, the ones who wore paper to dinner and called it fashion and meant it, the ones who wore white boots in a world that had not yet fully decided whether white boots were acceptable, and wore them anyway, and went dancing. They were not always comfortable. They were not always practical. They were, in certain documented cases, dressed in things that clinked. But they were alive to their moment in a way that left a mark on the stores, on the streets, on the photographs, on every piece of clothing you own that has a slightly shorter hem than it might have had if the 1960s had not happened. That is enough for tonight. Close your eyes, let the decade drift, let the go-go boots grow quiet and the hairspray settle, and the record player slow. The future those designers were so certain about has arrived, and you are sleeping in it, and it is warm and it is yours and it fits. Good night.